Ever since Charles Darwin reflected on the tangled bank of species so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, natural historians and scientists have sought to understand how species interactions shape community composition, function, stability, and robustness. This is Introduction to Ecological Networks. Hi, I'm Philip Stanichenko. I'm an assistant professor at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, based in the Department of Biology and the graduate program in Ecology, Evolutionary Biology, and Behavior. I develop mathematical and computational methods to understand how human activities are damaging fragile ecosystems, and, just as importantly, how those methods can inform better environmental policies and practices. Ecological networks are the latest attempt at studying how interactions between pairs of species combine and scale to result in consequences for entire communities. They have been used to show that predator-prey interactions are central to stable communities, and to warn us of cascading extinctions, where the loss of a single species can have knock-on effects that result in the loss of multiple other dependent species. In this video, I'll explain what ecological networks are, why they're useful, and where I think the field is heading next. I'm going to focus on foundational concepts that will help you navigate the growing literature on ecological networks, and highlight the key ideas like stability and robustness that have inspired my own research, which includes modeling species adaptability to improve estimates of extinction risk, and analyzing information sharing relationships among small-scale fishers to facilitate the adoption of sustainable fisheries policies. I'll also mention some of the latest work involving networks, environmental decision-making, and humans. I won't even get close to mentioning all the cool research that's going on right now. But hopefully this video will inspire you to find out more about ecological networks, and maybe even convince you to become involved in this exciting research program yourself. Before we get to ecological networks, let's start by asking, what is a network in the first place? Fortunately, the answer is very simple. A network describes relationships such as supply chains in manufacturing, flight routes between airports, or friendships among people using mathematics. At its most basic level, a network is made up of two things: nodes and links. In a social network, nodes might represent individuals, and links would represent the presence of a particular type of relationship, like a friendship, or a family tie, or a work relationship. In most networks, only one type of node and one type of link is considered at a time. So you might have one network of college buddies and another network of social media friends. Or you might combine them to build a composite network of both of those types of social relationship. It's worth knowing that mathematicians sometimes use a different terminology. In the field of graph theory, a network is known as a graph, nodes are vertices, and links are edges. Often, researchers will use those terms interchangeably, talking, for example, about nodes connected by edges. You'll also come across the matrix representation of a network. Rows and columns of the matrix represent individual nodes, and each non-zero element represents a link between two nodes. If we're interested just in the presence or absence of a link, then we'd have a binary network, and the matrix elements would be either 0, meaning absence, or 1, meaning presence. If we want to include more information about a relationship, say the strength of a friendship, or how frequently two people hang out, then we would have a weighted or quantitative network. In the matrix representation, matrix elements would take values other than 0 or 1. In some cases, we might want to talk about the directionality of a link, resulting in a directed rather than an undirected network. Consider a network based on Twitter. I might follow you on Twitter, but if you don't follow me back, then there would be only a single directed link between us, pointing from me to you. However, if we both follow one another, then there would be two directed links between us, one pointing from me to you, and one pointing from you to me. One huge benefit of taking a networks approach is the ability to draw on the work of researchers across many different disciplines. Social scientists have adapted contagion models designed by epidemiologists, and economists studying international trade have been inspired by energy flow networks in ecosystems. Part of the reason for this fertile cross-pollination is because networks offer a common scientific language for describing complex systems. This not only makes sharing methods easier, but also facilitates collaboration between researchers with possibly very different disciplinary backgrounds. So if a network is simply a mathematical description of how some things are connected to some other things, then what's so special about ecological networks? Well, nothing and everything. An ecological network is just like any other network. It has nodes, usually species, and it has links representing interactions between species who are part of the same community. But of course, a parasitic relationship between a wasp and a caterpillar is fundamentally different from being friends with someone on Facebook. In any case, an ecological network, like any real-world network, exists with its own context, a context that often requires careful thought when applying network methods. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get into methods, let's go over some different types of ecological networks. Ecological networks grew in part out of the work on food webs, which are depictions of feeding interactions among species. Remarkably, the earliest graphical depiction of a food web was drawn by Lorenzo Camerano in 1880. But the more familiar image of arrows indicating who eats whom was first presented in Charles Elton's classic 1927 book, Animal Ecology. Food webs were soon expanded to include descriptions of how energy dissipates and flows across trophic levels. They were then joined in the pantheon of ecological networks by other types of network focused on different kinds of interactions. Competitive networks, in which directed links indicate winners and losers in competition for scarce resources, were proposed to explain the potential for species to coexist in the same community. Competitive networks are commonly used to study plant communities, where facilitation has also been added to account for the fact that some plants can help and not just hinder the growth of other plants. Co-occurrence networks, in which two species are linked if they are both present at the same location, were proposed to describe communities for which measuring direct interactions can be challenging, as is the case when studying microbial communities, which can be made up of thousands of microscopic taxa. So far, we've been discussing networks in which, in principle at least, any species can interact with any other species in the network. These networks are known as unipartite networks. In the social world, friendship networks are unipartite networks. In principle, any individual can be friends with any other individual. Sometimes it can be helpful to limit interactions to those between two different taxonomic groups, like plants and their insect pollinators. These plant pollinator networks are bipartite networks, with plants on one level, pollinators on the other, with interactions only between the two levels. With social networks, a bipartite structure might be useful for representing which individuals sit on the management boards of which companies. Plant pollinator networks are also considered mutualistic networks because both partners benefit from the interaction. The pollinator drinks nectar from the plant, and the plant has its pollen spread by the visiting pollinator. Another example of a mutualistic bipartite network is a seed dispersal network. A seed dispersal network describes which animal species consume, excrete, and therefore disperse the seeds of a particular set of plant species. In addition to mutualisms, researchers also study antagonistic bipartite networks. One of my favorite examples are host parasitoid networks. An insect parasitoid, often a species of wasp, lays its eggs inside a different insect species. The growing parasitoid slowly feeds on its host from the inside, finally killing it as it emerges out of its larval stage. If you've seen the film Alien, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Bipartite networks in ecology are often weighted networks, containing information on the number of visits between each pair of plant and pollinator species, for example, or the number of infections between each pair of host and parasitoid species. Weights are also common in social networks, representing interaction strengths like the amount of goods imported and exported between countries in the international food trade network. Sometimes we need more than two levels and build tripartite networks, or networks with even more levels. For example, we might want to study the interactions between plants, their insect herbivores, and the parasitoids that infect the herbivores. Multi-layer networks represent the culmination of this desire for more levels and more detail. A multi-layer network can include as many types of nodes and as many types of links as you like. So you could have a single multi-layer network with plants, herbivores, and parasitoids as nodes, with links representing feeding between levels, competition within levels, and facilitation both between and within levels. As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of representing ecological interactions as a network is the ability to use methods developed in other disciplines. Let's start by looking at some standard network summary statistics. Even if you're already familiar with them, it's still worth contemplating what they mean for ecological systems. The most basic network summary statistic is connectance, the number of links in a network divided by the number of nodes squared. In a food web, you can think of the connectance as the number of observed feeding interactions relative to the total number of possible feeding interactions given the number of species in the community. Comparing the connectance between food webs with different numbers of species is tricky because we don't expect the number of feeding interactions to scale with the square of the number of species. In other words, we don't expect that doubling the number of species in a community should quadruple the number of observed feeding interactions. For this reason, ecologists have paid more attention to the average degree summary statistic. The degree of a node is the number of links involving that node. So a species that is connected to 3 other species has a degree of 3. A food web is a directed network, so we can talk about both in degree and out degree. In degree is the number of prey items a species has, and out degree is the number of predators that it has. As such, degree is the network equivalent of talking about diet breadth, the number of prey items a predator has, which is why ecologists tend to be just as interested in calculating average degree as they are in calculating connectance. We can move beyond the diet breadth of an average species by considering a network's degree distribution. Degree distribution is the frequency distribution or histogram of node degrees. In a food web, a homogeneous degree distribution would indicate that all species in the community have similar diet breadths. On the other hand, a heterogeneous degree distribution would indicate that the community comprises specialists, generalists, and species with intermediate diet breadths. Degree distribution is also studied all the time in social networks, where, rather than the number of prey items each predator has, you're interested in, for example, the number of friends each person has. In addition to thinking about how many interactions a species is involved in, we can use networks to investigate more complex multi-species interaction patterns. For example, a motif is a unique pattern of interactions between 3 or more species. Motifs are a convenient way to represent, in network terms, ecological processes like apparent competition and omnivory. Social scientists are also interested in motifs, but theirs looks slightly different. One common one is the triangle, which represents the idea that 2 of my friends, because we're all likely to hang out with one another, become friends themselves. So a V-shaped motif gets closed to become a triangle. In any case, once you've defined your motifs, you can then ask how common those motifs are in your network. This approach offers a neat way of testing how local network properties, involving handfuls of species, might impact global, whole network properties like community stability. An important idea in the history of ecological networks that we'll discuss next. Networks are a powerful approach to studying complex systems, be they ecological or social-ecological, because they offer a way of making complexity tractable. In ecology, networks offer a way of studying how interactions among species give rise to emergent properties of the community as a whole. Emergent properties like the ability of the community to withstand habitat loss or rising temperatures, emergent properties that cannot be understood simply by looking at individual parts of the network in isolation. Using networks to study this idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts has been explored under the guise of a number of terms, most notably stability, robustness, resilience, and persistence. You can think of stability as the ability of a community to return to its original state following some kind of external perturbation. Robustness as how well or not a community responds to an external perturbation. Resilience as the ability of a community to maintain its function after an external perturbation, and persistence as the ability of a community to maintain the same number of species after an external perturbation as it had before the perturbation. Over the past few decades, of the four terms, stability and robustness have probably occupied the minds of researchers studying ecological networks the most. Both words revolve around the idea of how ecological communities respond to change. In the case of stability, it's a relatively small change, like the loss of a few individuals from a single species. In the case of robustness, however, the change is more dramatic, like the local extinction of one or more species. The goal of stability analysis, technically local stability analysis, is to understand how interaction patterns influence the ability of a community to recover from an external perturbation that disrupts the regular dynamics of species growth, reproduction, and survival. Local stability analysis exists outside of ecological networks, and you might have come across the concept before in the context of ball and trough cartoons. You have a system, like an ecological community, that sits happily like a ball in a trough. Then along comes a perturbation, like someone prodding the ball with their finger. Of course, the ball is likely to move a bit. Local stability analysis asks the question, after the perturbation is removed, will the ball return to its original position, or will it come to rest in a different trough? In other words, will a community recover from the loss of a few individuals, or will it shift to a new stable state with even fewer individuals? Or possibly more individuals of some species, but fewer of others. Professor Robert May first formalized the question of stability in 1972. He used mathematical techniques from the field of random matrix theory to see whether having many species and many interactions in a community made it more or less stable to external perturbations. He found that more complex communities, those with more species and interactions, were less stable than simpler communities with fewer species and interactions. Ecologists found this result counterintuitive. How can we reconcile the vast biodiversity seen on Earth with the supposedly airtight mathematical result that more species means less stable communities? One big assumption in May's original work was that interactions are supposedly randomly distributed among species, including whether a particular interaction is positive or negative. This is where networks come to the rescue. Recent studies have dissected May's assumption and looked at how more realistic interaction patterns influences the stability or instability of ecological communities. One study that builds on May's work has shown that predator-prey interactions, a positive and negative pairing of effects, are stabilizing, but mutualistic interactions, a positive-positive pairing, and competitive interactions, a negative-negative pairing, are destabilizing. Another study has shown that food webs built from data collected in the field do not display May's famous complexity-stability relationship. That is, empirical communities with more species and interactions are not any less stable than simpler communities with fewer species and interactions. This story highlights how effective networks can be for studying complex systems. Its mathematical basis made it straightforward to integrate with random matrix theory, and its ability to represent field data made it possible to interrogate the theory and update it according to empirical observations. Another approach to a whole system measure of ecosystem health is the robustness of a community to secondary extinctions. Just like with a power grid, species depend on other species in their community that they might not be directly connected to. And one node going down can potentially also bring down other, more distant nodes. Understanding the implications of these pathways of connectedness is also relevant for social networks. For example, epidemiologists use human contact networks to manage quarantining and minimize the spread of communicable diseases. Returning to ecology, imagine a simple food chain with 5 species. If the species right at the bottom of the food chain goes extinct, then it causes the next species in the chain to no longer have any food sources, so it also goes extinct, which causes the species above that one to go extinct, and before you know it, the whole community has collapsed. This is a rather extreme example of cascading extinctions, but the principle still holds when considering more intricate and realistic connection patterns. It also leads to a rather nice way of quantifying the robustness of a network or community. How many species do you need to remove in order to cause the whole community to collapse? In our food chain example, removing only one species would cause total collapse. The other extreme case would be a very robust community that experiences no secondary extinctions at all. So you'd have to remove each species one by one to finally collapse the entire community. Naturally, the order in which you remove species will make a difference. So you have to average the number of primary removals over lots of different removal scenarios in order to get a fair estimate of robustness. While you're going through those different scenarios, you might notice that removing one particular species always seems to cause lots of other species also to go extinct. This species could then be a good candidate for being considered a keystone species, a species that has a disproportionately large effect on its environmental community relative to its abundance. The equivalent of a keystone species in a social network is perhaps a broker, an individual who has lots of connections and reach or pathways of influence in the network. You might also sit there and wonder if a species would really just go extinct without trying to do something about it. And you'd be right. I had the same thought and built a model that included the possibility that a species would try to find a new prey item if one of its existing prey happened to go extinct. A form of network rewiring, where links could detach and reattach, spurred on by the loss of a node from the network. In addition to providing a more realistic assessment of community robustness, this modeling addition also inspired a new perspective on conservation. As well as striving to protect a keystone species, whose loss might be disastrous for the community, we could promote biodiversity to facilitate redundancy in interaction choice. Think of it like having multiple insurance policies. The more diet options each species has, the more flexible the community, and the more likely it is that the community will be able to withstand dramatic perturbations. But like stability analysis, robustness analysis has its limitations. One big limitation is that it only considers bottom-up effects, extinction caused by the loss of food resources at lower trophic levels. Other dynamics are not considered. Nevertheless, robustness analysis has been very informative and influential because it represents a step forward from pairwise relationships to pathways of effects, and consequently the effects of pathways on whole system health and functioning. Stability and robustness analyses have played a central role in ecological research because they leverage the power of networks to relate small-scale interaction patterns to large-scale implications for the entire system. But they are by no means the only active areas of research involving ecological networks. I want to mention two others that are still in their infancy, but offer an exciting glimpse of what's to come. First, I'll talk about some of the ingenious ways that researchers are using networks to inform environmental management and decision making. And finally, I'll touch on what might be the most ambitious goal yet: integrating humans in what are known as social-ecological networks. With the world facing unprecedented environmental change, now more than ever, we need reliable evidence on which to base our decision making. Recently, my collaborators and I developed a new approach to urban planning and pollinator conservation using plant pollinator networks. We started by collecting interaction data from different urban land use types like gardens, parks, and pavements in 4 UK cities. At the same time, we extended the robustness analysis I mentioned earlier to include pollinator dispersal and resource switching, and then used the new method to estimate the city-scale effects of management interventions on plant pollinator community robustness to species loss. We found that allotments, known as community gardens in the US, were pollinator hotspots that supported a surprising number and diversity of pollinator species. Based on this information, we concluded that, if possible, the number of allotments should be increased and located next to other urban green spaces in order to maximize community robustness in cities and their surrounding areas. Other studies have used networks and their ability to represent the full suite of interactions in a system to clarify the role of rare species in providing pollination services. The big conceptual shift has been to ask about the contribution of each pollinator species to the successful functioning of the community as a whole, and not just their effects on the one or two most abundant or prominent plant species. A third line of work uses host parasitoid networks to assess the potential for insect parasitoids, which, remember, complete part of their life cycle by killing their hosts, to be used as biological control agents. The idea is to release or cultivate parasitoids in agricultural settings, using them to help manage and possibly even eradicate pests that are also natural hosts of the parasitoids. While biological control is often focused on the strength of one particular interaction, the pest and the control agent, taking a network's perspective enables researchers to study the impact of other interactions in the community, like competition, on that focal interaction. Now, this wouldn't be a succinct video without at least mentioning humans. Most of the time, humans are considered an omnipresent force that acts on networks, destroying habitats and removing species from food webs. But there's a growing body of work that looks to treat humans as a more active player in social-ecological systems. Here's a straightforward example of a social-ecological network. Imagine a marine food web that describes feeding interactions among fishes, lobsters, and crabs found along the coast of an island in the Caribbean. Also imagine a social network of fishers on the island that describes whom each fisher relies on to get information about the top fishing spots or the best fishing gear. Now imagine that we have data on which species each fisher targets, also known as their catch portfolio. Combining these three networks gives us a social-ecological network. We can connect the food web and the social network using links between individual fishers and the species that they target. What can we do with such a network? Well, we could investigate how a change in local fishing policy might spread through word of mouth through the social network, potentially changing which species fishers decide to catch. We could then investigate how the resulting changes in fishing pressure propagate through the marine food web. Indeed, in a recent paper, my collaborators and I took the first steps in that direction. We explored how social influence impacts which species small-scale fishers choose to catch. We found that fishers tended to listen to their more experienced and popular friends, more so than simply those that were older, when deciding what gear to use and where to fish. This result reinforces the potential for using informal social networks to accelerate change in fishing practices and increase the adoption of sustainable fisheries policies. Other researchers have used a different version of a social-ecological network. One approach for assessing ecosystem services draws links between 5 different types of nodes. 1. The species that provide ecosystem services, like kelp or salmon. 2. The categories of ecosystem service provided, like coastal protection or carbon sequestration or food. 3. Any relevant drivers of change, like extreme storms or invasive species. 4. Any relevant social institutions, like national parks or tourism businesses or NGOs. And finally, 5. Any actions that could be taken, like the construction of coastal defenses or the initiation of biodiversity monitoring programs. Ultimately, the goal of this approach is to map out how drivers of change and potential management actions might directly or indirectly alter the successful provisioning of ecosystem services. This is a perfect use case for networks. Start out by mapping what's important, analyze the patterns of dependencies, assess the effects on a whole system outcome, rinse and repeat, adding in more complexity as and when required. These are just 2 examples of social-ecological networks, and other types have been proposed and will be proposed. The one imperative that unites the best studies is that both natural scientists and social scientists are involved. So before you embark down the social-ecological networks rabbit hole, check out the excellent video by my colleague, Dr. Lorian Jasny, titled An Introduction to Socio-Ecological Networks. Wow, we've covered a lot. Ecological network definitions, types and properties, past and current research involving stability and robustness analyses, current and future research involving environmental decision-making and humans. But this still represents only a small fraction of the amazing research involving ecological networks. I hope this video has been informative and inspires you to find out more. The most exciting thing for me is seeing how interdisciplinary ecological networks is becoming and getting to collaborate with so many interesting, thoughtful, and fun people. If you have any ideas or suggestions that you want to share, please get in touch. I'm Philip Stanichenko. Thank you for watching Introduction to Ecological Networks.